Marcus Flynn had been a prisoner of the Jalari Empire for precisely 42 days, which he knew because he'd been keeping count on his personal tablet during the hours when he wasn't being summoned to explain human culture to aliens who'd conquered 17 worlds, and seemed genuinely baffled by concepts like casual Fridays and participation trophies. The accommodations were nice, better than his captain's quarters on the destroyed Herald, but gilded cages were still cages, and the constant presence of guards who could probably snap him in half without breaking a sweat was getting old. The summons came at what his tablet insisted was 1900 hours, though the Jalari homeworld's day-night cycle was completely different from Earth's, and Marcus had given up trying to maintain a proper sleep schedule weeks ago. The guard who collected him was new, or at least one Marcus didn't recognize, with the typical Jalari build of lean muscle and predatory grace, silver-white skin catching the palace's ambient lighting, and those elongated ears that swept back from the temples like elegant weapons. No visible expression, which Marcus had learned meant either "I'm professionally neutral" or "I'm imagining 17 ways to kill you," and context rarely helped distinguish between the two. They walked through corridors that managed to be simultaneously beautiful and intimidating, all crystalline surfaces that seemed to grow organically from each other, lighting that had no visible source, gravity that felt just slightly wrong in ways Marcus's inner ear had never quite adjusted to. The palace floated above the capital city, held aloft by technology that made Earth's best scientists look like children playing with blocks, and every viewport offered views that would have been breathtaking if Marcus weren't constantly aware he was looking at them as a prisoner. The guard deposited him in what Valith called her observation chamber, a circular room dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the planet below and the 3 moons rising over the horizon. It was the smallest space Marcus had been summoned to, which immediately set off alarm bells. Previous audiences had been in throne rooms with dozens of witnesses, public displays of the Queen interrogating her prize human captive about his species' weaknesses and strategic capabilities. Queen Valith the Unconquered stood at the primary viewport, her back to the door, which was either a sign of trust or a power move demonstrating she didn't consider him a threat. She was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller just by her being in them. Her formal robes were gone, replaced by what Marcus had learned was Jalari casual attire, fitted garments that allowed full range of motion, probably because warrior species never fully relaxed. Her hair, black as the space between stars, was arranged in an intricate style that definitely had cultural significance he didn't understand. She didn't turn when the door sealed behind him, leaving them alone in a way that Marcus was fairly certain violated several security protocols. "Captain Flynn," she said, her voice carrying those strange harmonics that suggested Jalari vocal cords operated on different principles than human ones. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. Given that refusing your invitations usually involves guards and mild threats," Marcus replied, "I didn't realize acceptance was optional." Valith's shoulders shifted in what might have been amusement. Fair point. She finally turned to face him, and Marcus was struck, as always, by her face, all sharp angles and perfect symmetry, with those solid black eyes that looked like they could see through deception and bone simultaneously. She was beautiful in the way a sword was beautiful, elegant, dangerous, designed for a specific purpose. "Tonight I requested specifically that we meet without the usual audience. I have questions of a personal nature." Personal questions from alien queens who destroyed his ship and killed 17 of his crew. This was going well already. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "I'm listening, Your Majesty." Valith moved away from the viewport, her movements precise and controlled in a way that made Marcus think she'd never once tripped or knocked over a glass in her entire life. "Your species has a concept you call beauty. I have studied human art, your literature, your entertainment media. You dedicate significant resources to this concept, entire industries built around defining and achieving it. She paused in front of a crystal sculpture that grew from the floor like frozen water. But your standards are inconsistent, contradictory. What one human culture considers beautiful, another considers ordinary or even offensive. I do not understand the underlying framework. Beauty is subjective, Marcus offered. Different cultures, different preferences. It's not really a unified concept. Yes, I understand that intellectually. Valith's hands clasped behind her back in a formal posture that Marcus recognized as her uncomfortable but trying not to show it stance. But there must be some commonality, some core principle that defines what makes something, or someone, beautiful to humans. She was looking at him now, with an intensity that made Marcus's instincts scream that this conversation was about more than academic curiosity. You want the diplomatic answer or the honest one? He asked carefully. I am a queen, Captain Flynn. I command truth. Marcus took a breath, weighing his next words. He could give her the safe answer, talk about symmetry and evolutionary biology, about how humans are programmed to recognize health and fertility, about golden ratios and facial proportions. It would be accurate, clinical, safely impersonal, or he could tell her the truth. All right, Marcus said, moving to stand near the viewport so he wasn't looking directly at her, which somehow made honesty easier. The honest answer is that human beauty, real beauty, not the manufactured kind in advertisements, has almost nothing to do with physical perfection. Silence. Marcus could feel Valith's attention like a physical weight. He continued, the most beautiful people I've ever known were beautiful because of who they were, not what they looked like. I'm talking about the doctor on my ship who'd stay up for 30-hour shifts because she couldn't stand the thought of someone suffering alone. About my academy roommate who laughed like a seal and couldn't tell a joke to save his life, but lit up every room he entered. About my grandmother, who had more wrinkles than smooth skin and hands twisted from arthritis, but who looked at the world with such joy that being near her made you remember why life was worth living. Marcus turned back to face Valith, who had gone very still. You want to know what makes someone beautiful to humans? It's authenticity. It's the courage to be imperfect in a world that demands perfection. It's kindness extended even when it costs something. It's strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty. He stopped, choosing his words carefully. It's being so completely yourself that pretending to be anything else would be a betrayal of everything you are. Valith's expression was unreadable, which Marcus had learned meant she was processing information that didn't fit her existing frameworks. You describe character traits, she said slowly, not physical attributes. Physical attraction exists, Marcus acknowledged. I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all, but it's not what makes someone beautiful in any lasting sense. The most objectively gorgeous person in the universe becomes less attractive when they're cruel or dishonest or so busy performing what they think others want that there's nothing authentic left. And someone who might not turn heads initially becomes stunning when you realize they're exactly who they present themselves to be. No masks, no performance, just truth. He could see her struggling with this, her head tilting in that way that meant she was analyzing data from 17 different angles. But surely, she said, and there was something almost vulnerable in her voice, physical form matters. Humans have preferences, standards. Your media is filled with images of idealized bodies, faces, forms. Sure, Marcus agreed. And every human culture has different ideals, many of which contradict each other. Some like tall, some like short. Some prefer muscular, others prefer soft. Some cultures celebrate features that others ignore completely. There's no universal physical standard, Your Majesty. But you know what's universal across every human culture I've ever studied? We're attracted to people who make us feel safe to be ourselves. To people who see us, really see us, and don't flinch. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Marcus started wondering if he'd crossed a line. Then Valith spoke, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. You speak of being seen, of authenticity, but what if the truth of oneself is? She stopped, seemed to recalibrate. What if being completely oneself would be considered weakness by one's society? And there it was, the real question underneath the academic curiosity. Marcus took a calculated risk and said gently, "Your Majesty, I get the feeling you're not asking me to explain human concepts of beauty in general. I think you're asking if you're beautiful by human standards." Valith's black eyes widened fractionally, the most obvious emotion Marcus had ever seen her display. For a long moment she didn't speak, and when she did, her commanding tone had dissolved into something raw. The Jalari value strength above all, strategic superiority, the ability to conquer and control. These are what make someone worthy of leadership, of respect. Personal beauty, as you describe it, authenticity, vulnerability, imperfection, these are liabilities. Weaknesses enemies exploit. She moved to a different viewport, putting distance between them. I became queen at 23 standard years. My mother died in battle. The succession required me to prove my capability through combat trials and strategic examination. I have ruled for 40 years. I have never shown doubt, never displayed weakness, never allowed personal preference to override strategic necessity, because to do so would invite challenge, and challenge would mean civil war. Marcus's chest tightened with unexpected sympathy. That sounds exhausting. It is the responsibility of leadership. It sounds lonely. Valith's shoulders tensed. Loneliness is irrelevant to the function of governance. Maybe, Marcus said carefully, but it's very relevant to the person doing the governing. He moved closer, not close enough to invade her space, but close enough to be conversational rather than formal. You asked me about beauty, Your Majesty. So here's my honest answer, specifically applied to you, since I think that's what you actually want to know. He could see her ears shift, focusing on him with the kind of attention that suggested this moment mattered more than she wanted to admit. Yes, Marcus said simply. I find you beautiful, not because you're a powerful queen or a brilliant military strategist, though you are both those things. I find you beautiful because right now, at this moment, you're willing to ask a question that makes you vulnerable. Because you're struggling with the tension between who you're required to be and who you actually are. Because underneath all that armor and authority, there's a person who cares enough about the concept of beauty to summon a prisoner in the middle of the night for an honest conversation. Valith turned to face him, and Marcus could swear there was moisture in those black eyes. You speak as though vulnerability is strength. My people would call that paradoxical. Maybe your people have been conflating strength with invulnerability for so long they've forgotten the difference. Marcus offered a slight smile. The strongest person I ever knew was my grandmother, the one with the arthritis and wrinkles. She buried 2 husbands and 3 of her children. She lost her home twice to natural disasters. She had every reason to become bitter, to close herself off, to decide the world was too painful to engage with authentically. But she didn't. She kept loving people even knowing she might lose them. She kept finding joy even when it was hard. That's not weakness, Your Majesty. That's courage in its purest form. A single tear tracked down Valith's face, the first genuine emotion Marcus had seen from any Jalari since his capture. She wiped it away quickly, almost angrily, like it was a betrayal. The unconquered queen does not weep. No, Marcus agreed quietly, but maybe Valith does, and maybe that's okay. The sound she made was half laugh, half sob. You are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, Captain Flynn, possibly both. Definitely both, Marcus confirmed. But I'm also honest, and honestly, I think you're one of the most beautiful people I've ever met, Your Majesty, not in spite of the cracks in your armor, because of them. Because you're willing to let me see them. Valith stood there, illuminated by the light of 3 rising moons, looking simultaneously like the powerful warrior queen who'd conquered 17 worlds, and like a person who'd spent 40 years performing strength and had finally, momentarily, allowed herself to simply be. "I don't know what to do with this information," she admitted. "Neither do I," Marcus said truthfully. "But maybe we could figure it out together, if you're willing to keep talking, keep being honest. Keep letting me see who you actually are instead of who you're required to be." Outside the observation chamber, the moons continued their rise. Inside, an alien queen and a human captain stood in comfortable silence. And something shifted. Something fragile and terrifying and absolutely beautiful began to take root between two people who had every reason to remain enemies and were choosing slowly to become something else entirely. The following days established a pattern that would have alarmed Valeth's security detail if they'd understood what was happening. Each evening, around the time 3 moons rose over the capital, Marcus would be summoned to various private locations throughout the floating palace, always alone, always with minimal guards, always under the pretense of continued cultural consultation. The Gallery court accepted this because their queen had always been meticulous about understanding conquered species, and if she wanted to spend extra time interrogating the human, that was simply thorough leadership. What they didn't know was that the interrogations had become conversations. Real conversations, without political posturing or strategic calculation, between two people who were discovering they had more in common than either had expected. Tonight Marcus found himself in what Valeth had called her meditation chamber, though it looked nothing like any meditation space he'd seen. It was small, intimate, filled with growing things, actual plants from various worlds, tended by automated systems but clearly arranged with personal care. The air was humid and carried the scent of flowers Marcus couldn't identify, and there was a small fountain in the corner, whose water moved in patterns that suggested artificial gravity manipulation for aesthetic purposes. Valeth was already there, sitting on a low bench surrounded by flowering vines, and Marcus stopped short because he'd never seen her look so unguarded. Her formal attire was gone, replaced by simple clothing. Her hair was loose, falling past her shoulders. Her feet were bare. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression made Marcus's breath catch. She looked younger, softer, almost shy. "This is my secret," she said without preamble. "The garden I told you about. No one else comes here. My guards think it's a secure communications chamber, and I've instructed them never to enter without explicit permission." Marcus moved carefully into the space, aware he was being trusted with something significant. "It's beautiful. Did you cultivate all of this yourself?" "The automated systems handle most of the care, but yes, I designed the layout, selected each plant, determined placement based on compatible growth patterns and aesthetic arrangement." Valeth gestured to the bench beside her, an invitation. The Gallery consider gardening beneath a warrior's dignity. Growing things is for subjugated species and civilians. Leaders should focus on conquest and governance, not, she touched a flower with surprising gentleness, nurturing life. Marcus sat, maintaining a respectful distance. "But you do it anyway." "I do it in secret, which I suppose proves their point about it being a weakness." Her voice carried bitter self-awareness. "I am the unconquered queen who hides in her garden like a guilty child." "Or," Marcus offered, "you're someone who understands that creation requires as much strength as destruction, and you're forced to hide that understanding because your culture has a narrow definition of power." Valeth's ears tilted toward him. He was learning that meant pleased or interested attention. "You have a talent for reframing my failures as virtues. I have a talent for recognizing when someone's being too hard on themselves." Marcus leaned forward slightly, studying a nearby plant with bioluminescent flowers that pulsed gently. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You've been asking personal questions for days, Captain. I suspect you're going to continue regardless of my permission." "Fair," Marcus smiled. "Why did you really summon me that first night, the night you asked about beauty? It wasn't actually about understanding human culture, was it?" Valith was quiet for long enough that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she did speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was in this garden that evening, tending the plants, writing poetry, terrible poetry that will never be seen by anyone else, and I caught my reflection in the fountain's surface. I looked at myself and thought, am I beautiful? Not powerful, not strategic, not imposing. Just beautiful. She turned to face him. It was such a strange thought. I've spent 40 years not caring about such things. Beauty is irrelevant to conquest, to governance, to survival. But in that moment, I desperately wanted to know if it was possible for someone like me, someone who has spent decades performing strength and hiding vulnerability, to be considered beautiful by someone who valued different things. So you asked the human prisoner, Marcus said with gentle humor, who had absolutely no reason to be honest with you and every reason to tell you exactly what he thought you wanted to hear. Yes. Valith's smile was self-deprecating. It was perhaps not my most strategic decision, but I hoped, that you might be honest anyway. Your species has a reputation for emotional transparency that borders on liability. We're terrible liars, Marcus agreed, which is probably why we lose so many wars to species with better strategic discipline. He shifted on the bench, angling to face her more fully. But since we're being honest, can I tell you what I actually thought when I first saw you? Not now, not knowing you, but that first day when I was dragged into your throne room as a defeated enemy. Valith's expression suggested she both wanted and feared the answer. Tell me. I thought you were the most intimidating person I'd ever seen. Not scary exactly, but commanding in a way that made my instincts scream that you were dangerous, and I should be very careful. Marcus paused. I also thought you looked lonely. Even surrounded by advisors and guards and all the trappings of power, you looked like you were utterly alone. Like you were standing on a stage performing for an audience that would never truly see you. Valith's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. That's remarkably accurate. And now, Marcus continued softly, now I look at you and see someone who tends secret gardens and writes terrible poetry, and asked a prisoner about beauty because she was tired of pretending she didn't care. I see someone brave enough to be vulnerable even though her entire culture tells her vulnerability is weakness. And yes, Your Majesty, I see someone absolutely beautiful. The tears came more freely this time, tracking down her face while she made no move to wipe them away. I don't know how to be this person and also be a queen. The Galactic have no framework for rulers who tend gardens and weep in private and care about whether they're beautiful. They'll see it as weakness, liability, grounds for challenge. Maybe, Marcus said. Or maybe you've spent so long assuming your people can't accept complexity that you've never actually tested that assumption. Maybe there are other Galactic who also write poetry in secret and tend gardens and wonder if being powerful means you can't also be vulnerable. Valith laughed through her tears. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple at all. It's probably the hardest thing you could do, showing your people that strength and authenticity aren't opposites. Marcus reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and when Valith didn't pull away, he took her hand. The contact sent a jolt through him. Her skin was warmer than human norm, and he could feel the slight tremor in her fingers that suggested this simple touch meant something significant. But I think you're capable of hard things, Your Majesty. You conquered 17 worlds. Maybe it's time to conquer the expectation that you have to be invulnerable to be respected. Her hand tightened around his. And if I fail, if I show them who I truly am and they reject me, challenge me, attempt to depose me, then you'll face it, Marcus said firmly. And you'll have the satisfaction of knowing you tried to be authentic, rather than spending the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you'd had the courage to be yourself. They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped, surrounded by flowers from 17 conquered worlds that bloomed in defiance of the idea that warriors shouldn't nurture beauty. Eventually, Valith spoke again, her voice stronger. Tell me more about human concepts of beauty, not the theory, actual examples. Tell me about the people you found beautiful and why. So Marcus did. He told her about Lieutenant Chen, who had a crooked nose from a sparring accident and laughed like a foghorn, and was beautiful because she never pretended to be anything other than exactly who she was. About Dr. Mbodo, who had extensive scarring from a lab accident and was beautiful because he turned his trauma into teaching moments and refused to let it make him bitter. About his mother, who had struggled with depression his entire childhood and was beautiful because she kept trying, kept getting up every day, kept loving her family even when her own brain told her she wasn't worthy of love. Valith listened with the intensity of someone cataloging data that might save her life, and gradually Marcus realized what she was really doing. She was learning permission. Permission to be imperfect, to struggle, to care about things her culture told her were irrelevant. She was learning that beauty, real beauty, wasn't about meeting external standards, but about having the courage to be authentic despite pressure to conform. I write poetry, she said abruptly, as if confessing to murder. I told you it's terrible, and it is, but I keep writing it anyway. Would you like to hear some? Marcus squeezed her hand gently. I would be honored, Your Majesty. So Valith recited poetry in her native language, which Marcus's translator rendered into stilted English that probably lost most of the nuance. And she was right. It wasn't technically good by any objective standard. The meter was irregular, the imagery was mixed, the emotional beats were uneven. But it was real. It was honest. It was a warrior queen admitting she felt things deeply and needed to express them even though she had no audience. It's beautiful, Marcus said when she finished, and he meant it in exactly the way he'd been trying to explain. Not technically perfect, but authentic, and therefore more valuable than all the perfect performances in the universe. Valith's smile was tremulous and genuine. You're either the kindest liar I've ever met, or you have exceptionally poor taste in poetry. Definitely the latter, Marcus confirmed. But I think your poetry is beautiful for the same reason I think you're beautiful, because it's real. Because you made it even though no one was asking for it. Because it exists just for the sake of existing, and that's worth something. She leaned against his shoulder then, a gesture so casual and trusting that Marcus barely dared breathe for fear of disrupting the moment. They sat like that for a long time, in a secret garden where an alien queen allowed herself to be vulnerable, and Marcus thought about how beauty wasn't about symmetry or perfection or meeting cultural standards. It was about moments like this, where two people chose honesty over pretense and found something worth protecting in the space between them. Outside the meditation chamber, the Galactic Empire continued its implacable expansion. But inside, surrounded by flowers and terrible poetry, and the beginning of something neither of them had names for, Marcus Flynn and Valith the Unconquered were learning that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit they want to be seen as more than their armor. The crisis came, as crises often do, without warning and with maximally terrible timing. Marcus was in his quarters, still technically luxurious confinement despite the increasingly friendly nature of his imprisonment, when alarms began shrieking throughout the palace. His door burst open to reveal guards who looked actually worried, which was concerning given that Galactic warriors had emotional ranges somewhere between serene confidence and cold calculation. Captain Flynn, you're to come with us immediately. The Queen has demanded your presence in the throne room. The formal throne room, Marcus noted with sinking stomach. Not the observation chamber or meditation garden or any of the private spaces where they'd spent the past week learning each other. This was public, official, probably very bad. The throne room was packed, more Galactic than Marcus had seen gathered in one place since his initial capture. They parted as he entered, creating a corridor of hostile stairs leading to the dais where Valith sat in full, formal regalia. She looked every inch the unconquered queen, posture perfect, expression cold, wearing armor that caught the light and threw it back like weaponized starlight. Her black eyes found Marcus across the room and revealed absolutely nothing. Standing before the throne were three Jalari in robes that Marcus's cultural briefings identified as High Council members. The advisors who technically couldn't overrule the queen, but definitely could make her reign difficult if they chose. The one in the center, an ancient warrior whose ears bore scars from what must have been dozens of battles, was speaking in a tone that managed to be both respectful and deeply displeased. Inappropriate relationship with the human prisoner. Your Majesty, we understand the value of cultural intelligence, but the amount of unsupervised time you've spent with this individual has become concerning to the council and frankly to the court. It suggests attachment, compromise. These are luxuries no Jalari ruler can afford, particularly when our empire faces potential threats from. High Counselor Thex, Valeth interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room instinctively stand straighter. You dare suggest I have been compromised, that my judgment has been impaired by interaction with a defeated enemy. Marcus felt his stomach drop. This was it. The moment Valeth would be forced to choose between the person she was learning to be and the queen she was required to be. He wanted to tell her it was okay, that he understood, that she should do whatever necessary to protect her position. But he was flanked by guards and very aware that speaking out of turn in this setting would probably result in immediate violence. Thex's ears flattened slightly, submission or maybe just acknowledgement of her authority. Your Majesty, we merely suggest that the human has served his intelligence purpose. Keeping him here longer than necessary poses security risks. We recommend his disposal tomorrow at dawn would be appropriate. The throne room went absolutely silent. Marcus had been in enough life-threatening situations to recognize when his odds had just dropped to zero. He kept his expression neutral, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear, and locked eyes with Valeth across the room. What he saw in her face made his chest tighten, not the cold queen, but the woman who tended secret gardens, struggling with a choice that would define who she was going to be. Disposal, Valeth repeated softly, dangerously. You recommend executing a prisoner under my explicit protection because you find his continued existence inconvenient to your political comfort. Your Majesty, Thex started. Silence. The word cracked like a whip, and the harmonics in Valeth's voice made every Jalari in the room freeze. You thought to manipulate me through threat, to test whether I have formed an attachment that could be exploited, to remind me that queens do not have the luxury of caring about individuals when empires are at stake. She stood from her throne and the movement was pure predatory grace. You were correct about one thing, High Counselor. I have formed an attachment. The human has taught me something valuable about strength, something the Jalari have forgotten in our millennia of conquest. Valeth descended from the dais, and every eye in the room tracked her movement. Captain Flynn asked me once to define beauty. I have spent 40 years believing beauty was irrelevant. That power was all that mattered, that showing vulnerability was weakness, that authenticity was a liability. But he showed me that true strength isn't about hiding who you are. It's about having the courage to be yourself despite the cost. She was standing in the center of the room now, visible to everyone, her voice carrying to every corner. I am Valeth the Unconquered. I have never lost a battle. I have expanded our empire through superior strategy and tactical brilliance. I have ruled for 40 years with the kind of cold calculation the Jalari respect. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer but somehow more powerful. I am also Valeth who tends a secret garden because nurturing life brings me joy, who writes terrible poetry because sometimes beauty exists for its own sake, who has spent 40 years performing invulnerability and is choosing, right now, to admit that performance has cost me pieces of myself I want back. Marcus could see shock rippling through the assembled Jalari. This was not how queens spoke. This was not how power functioned. This was breaking every unspoken rule their culture had built over centuries. Valeth's eyes found Marcus. You told me that the most beautiful people are those who have the courage to be completely themselves. You said vulnerability isn't weakness, it's honesty. You made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I could be both powerful and authentic, both strategic and genuine, both a queen and a person who cares about things my culture considers irrelevant. She turned back to the High Council, and her voice hardened. So here is my decision, delivered publicly so there can be no doubt about my position. Captain Flynn is under formal royal protection. He is declared part of my household, with all rights and privileges that entails. Any threat to him is a direct challenge to my authority and will be treated as such. Thex's scarred ears went flat. Your Majesty, that declaration essentially makes him your consort. The political ramifications are mine to manage, Valeth interrupted. I am not abdicating. My strategic capabilities have not diminished. My ability to rule has not been compromised. What has changed is my willingness to pretend that power requires me to be something other than who I am. She moved to stand directly before Thex, using her height advantage to intimidating effect. If the Gallery cannot accept a queen who tends gardens and forms attachments, and admits to being a complete person rather than a political construct, then perhaps it's time the Gallery updated their understanding of what strength actually means. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus could see various faction leaders exchanging glances, calculating political angles, trying to determine if this was an opportunity or a threat. He could also see something else: curiosity, interest, several younger Gallery looking at their queen with what might have been hope. Thex seemed to age several years in the span of seconds. When he spoke, his voice was careful. Your Majesty proposes a significant cultural shift. The Council will need time to discuss the implications. Discuss all you want, Valeth replied. But understand this: I am still your queen. I am still the unconquered. I am still capable of defeating any challenger in single combat and outmaneuvering any political opponent. I am simply choosing to do so while also being honest about who I am beneath the armor. She gestured toward Marcus. Captain Flynn, join me. Marcus moved forward on legs that felt slightly unstable, aware that every Gallery in the room was watching his every step, analyzing, judging. When he reached Valeth, she did something that probably scandalized half the court. She took his hand. This is who I am, she announced to the assembled room. A queen who has conquered 17 worlds and regrets most of them because conquest without purpose is just organized violence. A warrior who would rather tend flowers than wage war but will wage war brilliantly when necessary. A person who writes terrible poetry and has been desperately lonely for 40 years and is choosing, publicly, to admit all of that. Her thumb rubbed circles on Marcus's wrist, a gesture of affection visible to everyone. You asked me once, Captain, what makes someone beautiful? I have spent days thinking about your answer. About authenticity and courage and the strength required to be vulnerable. I'm taking off my mask now, in front of everyone, and hoping that what's underneath is enough. Marcus squeezed her hand gently, acutely aware they had an audience, but also completely certain about what he needed to say. Your Majesty, Valeth, you've always been enough. The mask was never the thing that made you worthy. It was just the thing that kept everyone from seeing how worthy you actually were. Someone in the crowd made a sound, surprise or perhaps approval, Marcus couldn't tell which. Valeth's black eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady when she addressed the court. The council will discuss. The court will gossip. Some will call this weakness. Others may recognize it as a different form of strength. But my decision stands. Captain Flynn is under my protection, part of my household, and anyone who takes issue with that can direct their challenges to me directly. Thex bowed slightly too deep, suggesting he was already calculating how to manage this political earthquake. As your Majesty commands, The council will convene to discuss appropriate protocols for the new situation. As the throne room slowly emptied, Jalari filing out in clusters clearly preparing for urgent strategic discussions, Valith remained standing in the center of the room, still holding Marcus's hand. When they were finally alone except for the mandatory guards stationed at the exits, she turned to him with an expression that managed to be both triumphant and terrified. "I may have just destroyed my political career," she said. "You definitely just rewrote several centuries of cultural expectations," Marcus agreed. "That was either incredibly brave or spectacularly reckless." "Both," Valith confirmed. Her free hand came up to cup his face, a gesture so tender it made Marcus's breath catch. "But it was honest. It was me, all of me, without performance or pretense. And I find I care less about political stability than I care about being able to look at myself in the fountain's reflection and recognize the person looking back." Marcus leaned into her touch. "For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I think that was the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. Not because it was strategic or calculated, but because it was completely, courageously you." She kissed him then, not tentatively, not with uncertainty, but with the kind of conviction that suggested she'd made her choice and would defend it against any challenge. Around them, the guards very carefully studied interesting architectural features and pretended they hadn't just witnessed their queen publicly claiming a human consort. When they finally broke apart, Valith rested her forehead against his. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "Good," Marcus whispered back. "That means it matters. That means you're choosing something worth being scared about. Stay with me while I figure out what happens next." "Your Majesty," Marcus said with absolute sincerity, "I'm not going anywhere." Outside the throne room, the Jalari Empire was already shifting to accommodate a queen who refused to choose between power and authenticity. Inside, two people from different worlds held each other and chose truth over performance, vulnerability over invincibility, and the terrifying, beautiful possibility that maybe, just maybe, you could be completely yourself and still be worthy of love. The political aftermath was, predictably, complicated. The High Council spent 3 days in emergency session, emerging with a formal statement that managed to be both supportive and deeply uncertain. The Queen's decision was within her authority. The cultural implications would require careful consideration. Anyone attempting to challenge Her Majesty's judgment would face the full force of Jalari law, which was code for, "We're not happy, but we're also not suicidal enough to directly oppose her." The court, meanwhile, divided into factions with the speed of cells undergoing mitosis. There were the traditionalists who saw Valith's public authenticity as dangerous precedent. The opportunists who calculated whether supporting or opposing her would better serve their political ambitions. And, most interestingly, a growing number of younger Jalari who looked at their queen's public vulnerability and seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, like they'd been given permission to be complex individuals rather than perfectly performing warriors. Marcus found himself in the bizarre position of being both prisoner turned consort and accidental catalyst for cultural revolution, neither of which had been covered in his academy training for what to do if captured by hostile aliens. It was evening. He was learning to think in terms of moonrises rather than clock hours, when Valith found him in the quarters he'd been moved to, which were significantly nicer and notably lacked the subtle security features of his previous accommodations. She looked exhausted, still wearing formal attire from what must have been another endless council meeting, but her expression softened when she saw him. "They're calling you the beautiful human," she said without preamble, moving to sit beside him on the absurdly comfortable furniture the Jalari seemed to prefer. "The court has decided that's your official designation. I thought you should know before you hear it from someone else." Marcus laughed. "The beautiful human, that's going to make diplomatic introductions awkward. Hello, I'm Marcus Flynn, apparently beautiful. Please don't hold that against me." Valith's smile was genuine. reaching her eyes in a way Marcus had never seen during those first formal audiences. They don't mean it as your physical appearance, though several court members have mentioned they find your features pleasingly symmetrical by gallery standards. They mean it as what you represent, the concept you introduced, the idea that authenticity has value beyond strategic utility. She leaned against him, the gesture becoming natural between them. 3 junior advisors submitted requests today to speak with me privately. Not about policy or military strategy, about personal matters, about whether they too could tend gardens or write poetry or admit to caring about things our culture deems irrelevant. You've accidentally started a movement, Captain Flynn. I just answered a question honestly, Marcus protested. You're the one who chose to actually act on it. You're the one who stood in front of your entire court and took off the mask. That was all you, Valeth. Her name still felt intimate in a way that pretty much, Marcus confirmed. Most of us spend our whole lives trying to figure out how to be authentic while also meeting society's expectations. Some people never manage it. They perform until the performance becomes all they are. Others refuse to perform at all and get crushed by social pressure. The lucky ones find ways to be genuinely themselves while still functioning in their culture. And which were you, Valeth asked, before your capture? Marcus thought about that, about his career in Earth Space Forces, the expectations of military discipline, the careful balance between following orders and maintaining personal integrity. Somewhere in between, I think. I was good at my job, respected the chain of command, followed protocols. But I also made terrible jokes during serious briefings, maintained friendships that military culture said were too casual, and occasionally made decisions based on what felt right rather than what the manual said was tactically optimal. He smiled ruefully. That last part is probably why I ended up captured. I tried to save my crew instead of abandoning ship like tactical doctrine suggested. And you'd make that choice again. Every time, Marcus said without hesitation. Because living with myself afterward matters more than making the optimal strategic decision. Some things are worth being imperfect for. Valeth was quiet for a moment, her thumb tracing patterns on his palm. The council wants me to formalize your position, create official protocols for a human consort, establish your role in court hierarchy, define the legal implications of your presence. She looked up at him. They're trying to make you fit into existing structures, to categorize and control what you represent. I'm resisting because the moment we do that, we lose the point. You're not valuable because you fill a political role. You're valuable because you exist outside the roles and reminded me that I could too. So resist, Marcus said simply. Tell them I'm the beautiful human and that's designation enough. Let me be undefined, uncategorized, just present. Maybe that's more useful to your cultural revolution anyway, showing that people don't have to fit into predetermined boxes to have value. Valeth's smile was brilliant and slightly mischievous. The council will hate that. Good, keep them off balance. Makes it harder for them to calculate how to control the situation. She laughed, full and genuine, with those harmonics that Marcus was learning, meant she was completely relaxed. You're teaching a warrior queen to be strategically authentic. That's either brilliant or completely contradictory. Definitely both, Marcus agreed, then grew more serious. But Valeth, you need to know, I don't want you to lose yourself trying to be authentic. The strategic brilliant warrior queen is part of who you are too. The person who conquered 17 worlds, even if you regret it, that's part of your story. You don't have to choose between being powerful and being genuine. You can be both. Can I? Her voice was small, uncertain in a way that reminded Marcus she was still learning this, still figuring out how to exist as a complete person rather than a carefully constructed role. You already are, Marcus said firmly. You stood in that throne room and told your entire court that you write poetry and tend gardens and care about beauty. But you did it with the authority and presence of someone who's never lost a battle. You didn't stop being the unconquered, you just added layers to what that means. That's not weakness, that's evolution. Valith leaned forward and kissed him, soft, tender, grateful. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. I think I'm falling in love with you, Marcus Flynn. The beautiful human who somehow convinced an alien queen that authenticity was worth the risk. Marcus's heart did something complicated in his chest. I think I'm falling in love with you too, Valith. The unconquered who writes terrible poetry and tends secret gardens, and had the courage to be vulnerable in front of everyone who expected her to be invincible. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching through the viewport as the three moons completed their arc across the sky. Outside, the Jalari Empire was slowly, uncertainly, learning to accept a queen who refused to choose between power and authenticity. Inside, two people from different worlds were learning that beauty, real beauty, wasn't about meeting external standards or performing predetermined roles. It was about having the courage to be completely yourself, imperfections and strengths both visible, and trusting that the right person would see all of it and call it beautiful. 3 months later, when a diplomatic crisis required Valith to demonstrate her continued strategic brilliance, she handled it with the cold calculation and tactical superiority that had earned her the title Unconquered. But afterward, she returned to her garden where Marcus was attempting to graft a cutting from an earth rose onto a Jalari flowering vine, probably botanically impossible but worth trying. And she tended plants beside him while discussing the day's events with honest reflection about what had worked, what hadn't, and how she felt about the decisions she'd made. The Jalari court, watching their queen operate with both strategic brilliance and authentic self-reflection, gradually stopped calling it weakness and started calling it wisdom. Cultural change moved slowly, but it moved. And at the center of that change was a warrior queen who'd learned that true strength included the courage to be vulnerable, and a human captain who'd answered a question about beauty and accidentally helped an entire empire remember that power and authenticity weren't opposites. They were just two parts of being completely, courageously alive.